Well, hello, fellow wargamers and history buffs, and welcome to another edition of Tactics Talk. Joining me today is my friend Brennan Close, and we are going to be talking about sort of a larger scale. We've kind of been dealing with some of the minutiae of tactics and the building blocks of your Napoleonic army. Last week, we talked about the infantry, the cavalry, and the artillery and some of the different aspects of how they can be used. And today we're kind of looking at how to put it all together. Is that a good summary of what we're going to be talking about, Brennan?
Yeah, it's fun, and it has big arrows moving around the map, just like in the history book.
Yes. I mean, and so one of my favorite books is that I think it's the Atlas of the Napoleonic Battles or whatever by John Ettling. And it's got, all of the maps, and then you've got the little stuff where things are moving. And half the time, you can kind of get a better sense of what's happening with the battle there. So that's always fun. So let's go here. As usual, if you guys have any questions or comments, or you just want to write in and say, how do you do? And let us know that you're there. Go ahead and post something in the comment section. I had made a mistake with the link that I posted on some of the different social media pages. So I was trying to get that all updated here this evening. So I know we might be missing a few people. It might take folks a few minutes to figure out how to find us. But we've got Hex to Hex is signing in. Good evening, Hex. Glad that you could join us. And Hex, where are you at? Are you in Florida, or where part in the universe are you at? I know that we talked about trying to collaborate in some way, shape, or form on a video. So trying to figure out what time zone to try to plan for. So Brennan, how is life treating you? Where are you at, and what's up?
Well, I'm based on the East Coast. I've been up in Vermont and New England this week, and tomorrow we're going to go visit the battleship USS Massachusetts, which is moored as a museum ship in Fall River, Massachusetts.
Okay. And do you know what era that battleship is? Is that a First World War, Second World War?
It's a Second World War battleship. It's one of the fast battleships. There were two classes of the fast battleships, the South Dakota class and the Iowa class. These are the big 16-inch gun battleships from World War II. There was the Washington and London naval treaties that all the naval powers were trying to use in between World War I and World War II to limit the arms race because the battleships were so expensive. And then different countries began to drop out of the treaty. And so in about 1930 or so, everybody began escalating. And from 14-inch guns, they went to 16-inch guns and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, here in Southern California, we've got one of the Iowa class battleships out here in Long Beach Harbor. I'm not sure which one it is. I don't know if it might be the Iowa. I'm not sure.
Might be the Iowa, yeah. Missouri is at Pearl Harbor, of course, and you can see the peace treaty that was signed in Tokyo Bay. And then New Jersey, I think, is moored in Philadelphia, but between Pennsylvania and the New Jersey shore. And then maybe it's Iowa or Wisconsin, I think was the other one.
Yeah, so it must be the Iowa that's here in Long Beach. When my kids were younger, they were part of like a YMCA type of a group, and they had an overnight where you could stay overnight on the ship, and you were in the bunks where the sailors were, and then you'd go down to the mess hall and have dinner in the evening and breakfast in the morning. So it was really cool. We got a full tour of it. And then the kids had a chance to actually, I can't say that I slept terribly well on that, but it was certainly an interesting experience, and very interesting to see, sort of the inside of the ship. I think that particular ship had done then some additional duty during the Vietnam War. I think it was involved with some shore bombardment. And then they brought it back in the 80s when Reagan had kind of brought some of the battleships out of mothballs. And I think that ship had like a it had had an accident in one of the turrets, where I guess one of the charges went off, prematurely, or while they were loading it, or while they were bringing it up, and blew up, and killed a number of the servicemen that were there servicing, and in that turret. So they were lucky that the battleship itself didn't go up. That's sort of thing that had happened to a couple of the different British cruiser dreadnought type of stuff there at the Battle of Jutland. So certainly dangerous stuff. Well, we got about 7 people tuned in so far. So I know as other people join us, they can pipe on in, but I thought we can get this show on the road. So Brennan, if you'd like, I can go ahead and bring up the first card, and we can, whoops, I'm taking all the credit. There we go. That's better. All right. So here we are. We're Tactics Talk number 3, and it's Army Maneuvers.
Yeah, this should be a fun one. Again, for people who are watching, we've written up the first version of a written tactics guide. La Bataille is an amazing system. It's got all this rich historical detail that the designers have put into it, and it has kind of an almost accurate. It's not a pure simulation for pure accuracy. It's a game, but it really has the feel and a lot of the mechanics of the Napoleonic period in the counter art and the box covers and so on. It's just a great time machine that way. And it's lots of fun to play, but it's complicated.
Yes.
The rules mechanics from version to version are complicated. And then even once you learn the rules mechanics, okay, how do you begin to apply those rules in a way that's coherent and makes sense and echoes or even uses historical knowledge? It takes some application to figure that stuff out. So it's been fun to write it up and to get some of the principles down in writing for the community. And as people have good ideas and scenarios or tactics that they want to share, I think it could be fun on a almost open source basis to begin including additional material from other players and groups into this type of guide.
Right, and that's a really important point, because while you and I have experience playing the game, other people have different experiences, and even every time I play, I'm finding new ways to try to use combinations of units that I hadn't had before, and oftentimes it's out of desperation. It's just like, oh, hey, this is working. This cavalry skirmisher with kind of supported by some artillery. Hey, this is working out fairly well, particularly against the Prussians in 1806, where they can hardly move at all. They're like molasses across the battlefield. So that came in very handy the last time I was playing there against Jim Soto. So, well, good. We got Meandering Mike and Hex to Hex here on board. Well, good. Are we ready to go to the next slide?
Yeah, let's just mention that. So, if people are interested, they can find the document version of the tactics guide up on the Facebook page in the file zone. And for the topic that we're talking about today, which is Army maneuvers, we've actually put a PowerPoint file up there also, which is kind of fun. It has some of these colored arrows, some green ones for the Russians and some red ones for the British and blue for the French. And you can, if you want, you can just download this PowerPoint, and you can put in a scan or a vassal screen capture of any of the games that you're playing. You just drop it in as a backdrop, and then you can use the arrows in the PowerPoint to work your way through a battle plan. It's a fun tool. People do that in their heads as they look at the game board, but actually having a visual of the map and a tool to do it with is pretty neat. So people can find both the tactics guide and the planning toolkit in PowerPoint up on the Facebook files page.
Right. So it's there at the La Bataille La Bataille series Facebook group. I think you do need to be a member of that, and all you would need to do is, if you go there, La Bataille series Facebook, there's probably only one, and they'll just ask you a few questions. Mother's maiden name, last 4 digits of your social security number, and then they'll let you. No, not anything quite that intrusive. And then you can join in, and that's a really good place. I mean, I've been posting more stuff with photos from the different play testing that I've been doing, different games that I've been playing, and then other folks have been putting stuff up there too. So that's a good way for people to kind of communicate. So terrific. Let's
Let's move
launch
to the next
into
one. Yep.
our first slide here.
So in today's discussion, we wanted to talk about some of the high level stuff. Let's back up one.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is the table of contents on the left of the guide, tactics guide, and then we want to talk today about army maneuvers or grand tactics. High level. How do you cross the map? How do you build up your army? And we're going to talk about what combat power is and what the theoretical maximum of combat power is. But there's theoretical maximum and then there's optimum. These are very different things. So we're going to look at that. And then we're going to look at some very specific fun examples from both the Mont Saint-Jean and the Austerlitz games. Those are big games with lots of maneuvering going on, so they're fun to look at. And we're going to look at, some steamroll attack approaches and some defense approaches, and how to use the planning across the battlefield to imagine and lay out the maneuvers of your army. As we get into it, it's good to keep in mind these principles that are up above in the top half of this slide. In order to make your army effective, it's important to understand what combat power is. Combat power is the ability to do damage and disruption and morale checks on the opponent. Firepower is a huge part of it in La Bataille as a game system. Firepower was very important in the Napoleonic world. Obviously, melee and hand-to-hand is important, but a real foundation of it is firepower, and firepower hour after hour in an attritional sense.
Right.
Another really important part of using a Napoleonic army effectively, which they began to do better in the Napoleonic period than maybe they had in the 18th century, is combined arms. So that's using the infantry and the cavalry and the artillery in an intermeshed approach rather than a very separate linear approach with a block of cavalry, a block of infantry, and the artillery somewhere diluted through it. It's much more of a synergistic thing. In addition to using the types of troops in a meshed way, it's very important to keep in mind for your army that concentrating your force on one or a couple of places, it's a classic military philosophical principle that truly works well in the games. And if you dilute your attention and dilute your force, you're not going to live up to the potential that your army has. So there's a really, to play effectively, a very strong focus of your army spatially and with intent usually works pretty well. And another thing to keep in mind at the army level is this question of mutual support. At the army level, that means that you want, divisions to be within maybe 4 to 6 hexes of each other, not farther. And you want corps to be within 8 hexes, or maybe 10 is a little far. You want the whole corps, deployed on maybe a 10 or 15 hex frontage and not too far away from its neighbors, because as you start to stretch out an army, they get very, very thin and they can't help each other out, and you start to have vulnerabilities. So these are very important principles to keep in mind to play strongly and well.
Very good.
Let's go to the next slide. This slide is an interesting look at maximum theoretical combat power. So combat power is basically when all of your units are shooting or meleeing. And the theoretical maximum, theoretically, is if in any given turn, every single unit you have is sending its firepower downrange and making a melee attack all at the same time.
Right. That does not happen very often.
Doesn't happen very often. But you want to get towards an optimum use of that. So you want to have, a lot of your firepower going downrange. You don't want to be wandering around, but you don't want it to be diffused across the battlefield. You want it to be going into a place that has intent behind it. And what sometimes you can see is when players are new, they start maneuvering on the battlefield with all these Napoleonic pieces, and it tends to happen that they tend to just gravitate to a very thin, very, very wide deployment. And there's actually a reason for that. Like your mind is pulling you to spread everything out so that every unit is getting some traction. And that is maybe the theoretical maximum combat power in a very wide, very thin linear deployment. But it actually, from an effect standpoint, that theoretical maximum, it has drawbacks. The drawbacks are it's unfocused and you're dishing out damage all across the enemy army, which is going to absorb it all in an averaged way. Whereas if you can get your army concentrated and get the firepower and melee shock output that it's producing concentrated, you can get towards a combat advantage in the area where you're fighting.
Right. So it's about selecting that area that is important for the purposes of either victory conditions or the terrain that's on the map, etc., or where your objectives are. In many cases, with La Bataille, it's about getting some of the enemy corps or divisions to go on a level. And so having your forces in a position where they can deal the maximum amount of damage or achieve that objective is important.
Against a single target. And you just put your finger on something which is really important, which is that in La Bataille in particular, and if you read some of Napoleon's thinking about his sort of philosophy of war, a lot of times the objective, the terrain is almost secondary. The single biggest objective is to knock out the enemy army.
Yes.
And that means getting a hold of a portion of the enemy's troops and wiping them out, routing them or, attriting them by firepower, killing them. And so a frequent goal of the use of your army is to put yourself in a position where you maneuver for an hour or two, and then there's a big combat zone for 2 or 4 or 6 hours. And when that combat begins, the pitched combat, that's the time when your maneuvers want to set you up for that combat episode to be tremendously effective for you and to be ineffective for the opponent.
Right. And that would be, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, carry on.
And so just spreading yourself out, it's going to send a lot of, stuff downrange, but it isn't necessarily going to, really have it happen in a focused way on a small portion. And you don't get the 3-to-1 proportionality that often leads to an attacker's victory kind of thing.
Right.
And so if you look at some of the principles that we've got over there on the right, a very thin, very wide linear deployment, it does give you the combat power going downrange, which we've shown on the slide with lots of little arrows. Every single unit is active. But it actually starts to dilute and remove your ability to conduct intentional, synergistic combined arms. It removes the concentration of force of selecting, either your terrain objective or a particular corps or division of the opponent that you want to try to put on a level in a focused way. Being very wide and diffuse actually dilutes that concentration of force. And the other thing is, if you look at this deployment, we could zoom in on the left-hand pane there. And you can see that the left-hand, this is Mont Saint-Jean, and the French army has deployed across the entire front of the battle. It's a very big frontage. A lot of stuff is happening. But the far right wing and the center and the far left wing, they're completely out of mutual support distance of each other. Like all of the activity that's happening on the left wing, it's happening 2 or even 3 miles away, like 30 or 40 or 50 hexes away from the right wing. And so if the left wing gets in trouble, the right wing can't help it. If the right wing gets in trouble, the left wing can't help it. And the center is heavily tied up with everything. So
Right.
although there's lots of, storm and noise, it's starting to get very thin from a tactical coherence point of view.
Well, and the other thing is, if you look behind the line, there's not much of anything that you would call a reserve. There's in a few places there might be a battalion here or there that's behind the line, but if either things go badly or things go well, you don't have then the reserves to push in as well. So with that very linear type of arrangement, I have to go really well all the time. Otherwise, you're in trouble.
And what that, it looks really good at first, and it generates a lot of firepower all online at first. But what happens, because La Bataille is an attrition-based game, we were having a very interesting lunch with Dennis Sporzo at the Buckeye Game Fest in Ohio. And Dennis was talking about how, fundamentally it's an attrition-based game system. And what happens is it looks very beautiful at the beginning, but the battalions begin to attrit and disorder and rout. And before too long, like maybe 2 or 4 turns, all that beautiful, elegant front line starts to get thin and run. And then it isn't nearly so continuous anymore. And then the army can tend to collapse. Whereas if you have a more dense formation with reserves, you can step up and continue pushing on that selected area. So let's go to the next slide and look at maybe sort of an optimized way. So this is an overlay on top of that same Mont Saint-Jean battlefield. This is sort of an indicative example of how you could take the same French army and deploy it in a more optimized way. So there's a difference between maximum and optimum. Maximum is everything going all at once, but in order to do that, you have to spread it out so widely that it loses focus and intent and reserves. Whereas if you think about how do we optimize it in the La Bataille system, well, optimize means, yes, it's dishing out a lot of firepower. So this is a formation or deployment with 3 French major corps, the first corps, the guard, and the second corps, each on a frontage of maybe 10 hexes, 10 to 12 hexes. And they're right next to each other. And there are gaps in between where the corps and army level artillery can fire. It can fire forward through these selected, defined channels. So you're getting massive grand battery firepower coming out in between the corps in a zone of maybe 2 or 3 hex gap. And the opponent can't come back against you because those are covered by the cavalry divisions and cavalry corps. The cavalry may be back guarding the grand batteries, ready to charge after the impact is made. So the artillery provides a huge fire base into a narrow zone. And anybody who's in that narrow zone is going to get plastered.
Right.
And then
with the infantry, the way it's deployed, you're going to have a lot of difficulty trying to get to it or around it as well to get that artillery.
That's right. So the artillery is at a depth of maybe 6 or trying to get to 6 or 5 or 4 hexes that can start out maybe 7-ish back. And then the infantry, rather than being spread extremely to maximally wide, it's actually deployed for a time purpose. It's deployed almost with a front line of skirmishers. You can see on the little box for each corps, there's some light infantry Légère battalions up front in skirmish formation. Right behind those is a first row of line infantry, and those battalions probably will move into line. So the skirmishers will engage. Then the first row of the battalions will come up with a musketry duel, and they'll do some hits, but they're expected to disorder and run away. And then each corps, by being organized in a checkerboard, there are open channels where that forward row of battalions, so it's going to do some hits for a while, and then you're expecting it to have to run away, and it will. So they'll disorder and or route back through the checkerboard channels. And when the front battalions have to disorder back, The second row of battalions steps forward.
So we have an interesting comment here from, is it Jeff from Hex to Hex? I noticed the spacing in these images between units. I learned in Ney versus Wellington that this was necessary to protect from adjacent units being affected by rout. Same case in this system. So yes, so in the La Bataille rules, if you have to, if you're forced to, by disorder or rout, if there's not an empty gap for you to go through, you're going to be going over the top of the units that are behind you. And then those units have to make a morale check. And in some of the rule sets, there is a penalty. And so there's a chance that you could end up having one unit disorder a rout and then end up triggering several other units to do the same thing. We had one particular case when we were playing the Battle of Moskva on Vassal a couple of years back, where one of the Russian units had routed. It was kind of stuck in a spot, and it had to go over about 3 or 4 units, and you just had to cascade one after another after another. And at the end, I think, nearly half of the division ended up disordering or routing because there was nowhere for them to kind of get through and get back to where they would go for recovering. So, yes, similar concept in other game systems.
And it's actually pretty historical. If you, even in the Regs 30, there's a little note that says there was a reason that armies of that period had a checkerboard appearance. It's to create route channels and movement channels so that the disordering units at the front, you're expecting them to do some damage, take attrition, and need to fall back. And then you're make this initial arrangement with depth to it so that the second row of battalions simply steps up and they can continue the musketry fight. Or if the artillery plus the skirmishers are beginning to have a good impact, they can launch column melee attacks and press forward. And if the second row doesn't work, then the third row can proceed. And by the time you've had 3 of these organized waves come through, you're really having impact on the front line, and you're making geographic progress, you're advancing over your objectives, and the whole army's moving forward. So this type of in-depth deployment in the La Bataille game system, and with some historical authentic echoes, tends to be more like A, what was done historically by the Napoleonic period, and B, it's in game terms, it's much more effective usually than an extremely thin line. And so if you zoom out, we can look over at the right at some of those principles. Typically, a deployment in depth, maybe a half or a third of the frontage, is actually going to be much more optimum than the thin lines. And it actually covers all of those principles. With it's generating plenty of combat power in a targeted, focused way, in an intentional way. It has the combined arms because the infantry, cavalry, and artillery are all working together. It is concentrated on a chosen target. It's not just broad and random. And all of these groups at the corps or division level are within reach of each other. Also, you can then use the terrain to protect your force, and it's a good use of time and space. If your army is compact and the defender is spread, then time and space are in your favor, because then the entire weight of your force can land on the center or a wing, and the opposing army can't even reach you in time to get it to hinder you. So it's a use of time and space in your favor.
Right, and this is a particular challenge at like a game like Mont Saint-Jean, where the English or the Allied force is stretched out over such a long gap there along the that ridge. They do have some depth with units in the back with reserve, but it is a very long deployment, and given depending on which rule system you're using, it can be very hard to redeploy units to go from one wing of the army to go help out another wing of the army as a result.
And so what you find for a defensive strategy for the Allies, defensive maneuver, in game terms, maybe not historical, but in game terms, as people begin to use in their La Bataille games these denser, more optimized, narrower but deeper formations, you may find that these steamrollers are very difficult to stop. So then you have to adapt the defensive tactics. And let's go to the next slide, which is a look at a couple of Allied maneuvers at Mont Saint-Jean. which are different from history, but actually work pretty well in the game, which are corner defenses. So if the French have decided to launch, 3 major corps instead of across the whole width of the battlefield, but picking one section, like either the section between to the west between Hougoumont and off to the west, or the center section between Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, or the right-hand section between La Haye-Sainte and the Prussian arrival at Papua. Like, those are 3 major zones, and the French can launch a compact steamroller in any one of those zones. And if the Allies remain thinly deployed on the historical position in the game, typically that steamroller will blow through them and run the table.
Yeah.
Which I think, Eric, you've seen a number of times.
Oh, I've both experienced it on both sides of the table. In fact, I think the first time I met you was you were helping that steamroller against my poor little forces there. You had just a little bit too much glee in your eye when you rolled up, what was it, the Black Watch or one of the Scots units there with your grand charge kind of a thing. So overwhelming. And there's, as you said, there's those 3 channels to try to move through. And I think where the French tend to go wrong is if they try to attack through all 3 of them, because then they are too dispersed. And even going through 2 gets to be a little tricky, because you still need to try to contend with the Prussians whenever they show up. So it does get very, very, very crowded and very clogged. So you do have to try to dispose of your troops in a controlled way. But it does make for a fun. So in this particular picture here, we've got looks like the Allies are falling back towards I guess that would be the northwestern corner of the battlefield for their main fighting position. Is that correct?
That's right, because in game terms, in fact, we've seen, and many people who've played the game have seen, the Hougoumont position out front, which historically was a rock on the battlefield. In game terms, it's actually pretty hard to hold on to it. So Hougoumont is given up early. But if the Allies are facing even the possibility of that type of concentrated French steamroller, a response maneuver can be right from the very beginning of the game. You get everybody, you pack them up, and you move them as fast as they possibly can to one or the other corner. And the northwest corner has some good rough terrain with towns and villages and sunken roads and woods. And back there, if you move, you just basically abandon the historical position early. You leave a few pickets out on it to slow things down, and they fall back. You intentionally fall back, but you concentrate for a planned fight quite a bit farther back. This is an effective surprise maneuver.
Right, and it then buys time for the Prussians to mass as the reinforcements come in. And
yes, and it leaves that French steamroller rolling through the air instead of rolling over your units.
Well, and it also leaves the French steamroller with their flank wide open if they've got everything turned and they're heading in that particular direction. So that's a great concept here for how to deal with it.
And then another approach. So one approach for the Allies, you kind of look at the map and look at the terrain, and you ask yourself, where can this British army defend effectively? And you know that the Allied army has those really excellent British rifle skirmishers and the strong British infantry, and then a bunch of medium to poor allies who are good at absorbing and delaying. So you can leave them out on some of those forward picketing positions and pull the rifles and the Highlanders and the Guards back and be willing to give up ground in order to pick the fighting position of your choice where your army will win or has a better advantage. And then the opposite approach is, rather than early in the game moving off to the northwest, you move off to the northeast and you send the entire Allied army to join with the Prussians. You fall over to your allies. There's much better defensive terrain over in the swamps and villages.
Yeah, that side of the map does have some good stuff.
So after people have begun to use, some of these more steamrollery attack approaches, then the defender has to start not just defend in a linear historical sense on the historical position, but use the game to play around with, hey, should we try it here? Should we try it here? And then where does my army fight best in what types of terrain? So this is a look at defensive maneuvers in response to, a heavy, much more in-depth steamroller type of attack.
Right. Concentrated attack is probably
concentrated attack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As opposed to a diffuse type of attack.
Exactly. So now let's go to the next slide and let's take a look at the Austerlitz game. The La Bataille Austerlitz game is really fun for maneuvers. It's got a huge map with medium-sized armies. So there's a lot of marching and maneuvering that you can do. It's really fun.
The map, if you have it, it's about 8 foot long and about 4 foot wide. So it takes up a huge amount of space on your table or wherever. You might have to nail it to the wall there to get it all in.
And there's a very nice vassal module with it as well. And what you see on the map is that the Allies have been given a bunch of victory point targets with those green stars in the mid to back of the geography, and the Allies are trying to capture at least one or several of these positions early in the morning by the 11 a.m. turn in order to tilt the victory in their favor. And then the French have a series of geographic objectives with those blue stars that they're trying to capture by the end of the game. So there's a lot of back and forth tilting of where people want to go. And then this is a real opportunity for maneuver because the armies begin in a very dispersed set of starting positions, and they can go left, middle, right. And so there's a lot of fun in thinking about, are we going to go left? Are we going to go to the middle? Are we going to go right? And what's that going to look like? So this is just an overview of the map. Let's go to the next slide. And now this is an example of using that PowerPoint toolkit that we did. It's got the game map as a screen grab dropped in as the background, and then it has arrows on it that show the approximate distance that a corps or division can march in about an hour. So the green arrows are an example of the Russians maneuvering, army maneuvers, taking the whole army. And this example takes the starting positions, and it basically sketches with the green arrows an approximate look at what the Russians did historically, the Allies did historically, which is that Napoleon had baited them into making a left-facing attack into the rough terrain, into the villages of Sokolnitz and Telnitz and the pheasantry that are off to the left. And there you can see the Russian advance guard, the Austrian advance guard, and the first column and the second column heading towards their historical objectives. That's right about where Tolstoy wrote it in War and Peace. Fighting, there's a great scene in this. And Kutuzov is standing in the center asking the Tsar, are we really sure we want to do this? And the Tsar says, yes, it's the plan, please proceed. And so they proceed. In this version of this plan, the green arrows coming in from the far right are an example of a change from history where the Russian Guard, the fifth column, and the advance guard with those really long arrows, that's Bagration and the Russian Guard trying to come in for mutual support in game terms to support those historical attacks for those green objectives. But what you can see is this type of Russian approach in the Austerlitz game, it actually results in a pretty widely stretched Russian army, which is a lot like that extremely thin, extremely wide line that we saw in the first slide, which was maximized but not optimized. So let's go to the next slide. The next slide is an approximate sketch of what Napoleon did historically, which was to bring Davout up on the south to support the defense of the rough terrain. Sokolnitz and Telnitz, Davout and his Third Corps marched up from Vienna in a forced march all night for 2 days, and they arrived just in time to hold a defense along that zone. Meanwhile, Napoleon was concentrating the rest of his army into the center And about midday, the fog lifted, and the French launched a concentrated attack into the center and broke the center of the Allied army. So if you go to the next slide, you can see, using our planning toolkit, this is the Russian plan from before, overlaid with the French plan. And you can actually get a sense of what happened historically, and you can get a sense of, would you want to try this in your game? Because the Russians are going left, as you can see, trying to get all those objectives in a very diffuse sort of way. And the French pull together into the center, and like a battle axe, they launch one of those concentrated attacks up onto the plateau, and we know what happened historically. So the toolkit and the thinking about, army maneuvers are really fun and very useful for planning a game. So we've been playing a really fun Vassal online Austerlitz game, and since we're now into the middle of the game, we can actually use this toolkit to show you guys some of the planning that the Allied side did in the Austerlitz game. So let's go to the next slide. So we saw from the slide above, Eric, if you click up and then click down, you can see the one above is an Allied maneuver, the historical one. If you go up.
You want me to go to the next slide, or
go back one slide?
Okay.
So that's Allies going left. Now click forward. So this is Allies going to the middle, and you can see the difference. So we took the PowerPoint kit and we said, well, what if instead of doing the left push, what if we pushed to the center? How would our army begin to maneuver, and what would it start to look like? And we saw that by about 10 a.m., by laying in these arrows, that we could march the first column and the second column to converge all the units towards the center. And we were just exploring what would that look like. And we realized that by about 10 a.m., we could bring most of the Allied army into the central open area of the battlefield. And that once we were there, then we could launch a concentrated attack either to the left or to the right.
Right. And at this point in time, the French don't have all their forces on, and they are rather dispersed across the battlefield. So that could be a very viable option for the Allies.
That's right. So we thought pretty hard about a convergence to the center, and we could use those arrows in the planning kit to estimate more or less when all the groups could arrive. And then, like, we weren't even playing yet. We were just kicking this around for an hour or two or three, before the game got started. And then we looked at another option where, well, what if we moved everybody to the right? So let's go. So there you go. That's what it looks like. And you can see that the Allied army can all arrive over to the right side, but it takes an hour longer. If you converge everyone from the wings to the center, you can all arrive at the center open field about 10 a.m. But if you decide you want to go to the right, it's an hour more of marching time to get over there. So now, Eric, if you back up 2 slides and then 1, and you can, so this is Allied left push, center, or right. And the battle planning toolkit, you can set up, 3 separate PowerPoint slides with a left, a center, and a right, and just give you, or you can do it in your head, right? But this is a fun toolkit to really show it graphically. Looks just like out of a history book too.
Yeah.
Which is so now we had been planning what the army level maneuvers might look like. And let's go to the next slide. And then we realized that in the center push and the right push, there were features of each that we liked. In the center push, it brought the Allies into that center open field. Here's a question. Are the cavalry units being used as flank screens or support of the main attack? Well, that's exactly well asked. Both. If you zoom in, Eric, here to the left side of left corner, lower left corner, yeah. What you see here hex to hex, you can see that the Austrian advance guard, which is infantry, they were in a very far isolated position. So they decided to march to their right, and the advance guard cavalry moved rapidly out ahead of them. So there's the advance guard moving to the right. And then the advance guard cavalry, which started behind, it actually hustled up, crossed over the path of the infantry, and you can actually see the cavalry screening from 10 a.m. to noon. The cavalry is the long arrow at the top. That one, that's the cavalry screening the march of the infantry. So that's cavalry being used very specifically in a screening role. And then if you move over to the right and upward, we see cavalry being used in a strong, aggressive raiding role. We also realized that there was one victory objective hung out in the middle of the battlefield, isolated and undefended. It's pretty much undefended by virtue of how the game is set up. It's a weak spot. And we realized by doing this planning that we had one set of light cavalry doing that screening of the infantry moving on the wing. But if we concentrated all of our heavy cavalry as fast as possible to the center, that we could stage a cavalry raid onto that village within an hour of the game start, take it over, get the victory points, and then get the heck out of Dodge.
Yeah, because you don't need to hold it. You only need to have occupied it before the 11 a.m. turn.
And it was very specifically the use of, taking an overview of the map and thinking about the capabilities of the different forces, both for screening and for fighting. So we concentrated the entire cavalry of the army, all the light cavalry, all the heavy cavalry into a raiding force. So we knew when they arrived at that village, they would have much better odds in their favor if they had to fight. So the cavalry used its speed and its power. There was one little skirmish, and we were able to succeed in that raid. And then we said, well, okay, so that raid was an idea that came out of how do we do that central maneuver? It showed on the map that this was an opportunity. And then the main maneuvers of the army, we decided we liked best with that march to the far right. Because the march to the far right, by 11 a.m. to noon time frame, would put the army in position to be not on the central hill, the Pratzen Heights, but to be on a different hill further to the north, further to the right, with terrain that we like the look of. It has good infantry and artillery defensive terrain, offensive, defensive, offensive terrain that we could either hold or advance forward from. So we designed these mutually supporting positions in the yellow blocks of where each column would end up. So if you zoom back out, now we can see the advance guard with its cavalry screen moving in from the left. We see the heavy cavalry of the army racing up to the center for an aggressive raid and then falling back with the arrows coming back. Meanwhile, the main columns are marching towards intentionally selected positions where we like the look of the terrain. And now we can zoom in to the next slide, to go to the next slide, and we can start to look more closely at that defensive position. So, or the fighting position. So we decided that the army would all march to the right as a major maneuver with that raid. The cavalry raid worked. And now we're in the process of thinking about what's it going to look like if we decide to deploy and fight in this part of the battlefield. This is not historical. Historically, this is where the advance guards of the two armies, the Lanz Corps and Bagratians, they fought a heavy action out there, but we decided to bring the entire army there. All
right, and we're just going to send Lanz Corps against you. Should be easy.
Should be easy.
Right off. Yeah,
that's right. So there's one high quality French corps, but we decided from the beginning we were going to maneuver the entire army into a concentrated position with mutual support so that it could act together once it got there. It's taken it took hours of the game to get there, but now it's arriving and now it can start to do stuff. So let's look at the next slide, which is a zoom in onto that position. So now that we knew that we were planning to have the combat off in that part of the battlefield, Now it made sense to look more closely. What's this position like? So if you zoom in here, you can see some general outlines of the position. We can see that on the left, there's a vineyard, which is rough terrain, and it's a perfect place to anchor the left flank because it blocks artillery fire and blocks cavalry charges. So if we put the first column there, that's a pretty good spot for it. Now we have a flank anchor. Then it just makes sense to the next group should be the second column, which is it's a small infantry corps. And then the next group, which is a weak column, the third column, it sort of naturally fell into place. It's a pretty weak group, but it doesn't have to defend much. It's got the woods. So it's going to sort of have a thin defensive line behind the woods to start with. And it's going to contribute its artillery off to the left to help the main fighting position of first and second column. And then the advance guard, which is just naturally in a forested position. And then there's a wide open, clear terrain zone, which is actually ideal for the Austrian contingent, which is a very linear type of troops. They fight better in line than in column. So it's just very natural for them to end up here at that clear zone and fight. So by looking at the map and thinking about those timed maneuvers, we came up with a position we were pretty happy with. And we also had some reserve units that left the Russian Guard, a very strong group, able to form a reserve. And then there's an independent division under one of the Russian generals, which is another part of the reserve. And then the Austrian advance guard, after that long march in from the flank, it's able to fall in behind the left flank. So now we have a coherent, concentrated fighting position. We're starting to see some good artillery positions, and we have reserves. So this started to feel like a good way to fight the battle.
Yeah, certainly better than being spread out across, I don't know how many miles of battlefield are covered with those maps.
Exactly. So after we had sketched in what the fighting position looked like, then we decided to go one step closer and not pin down like exactly where every unit's going to be, but say, okay, these are the approximate positions of the columns. But what's it going to look like when you actually deploy the units into more or less fighting formation? So let's go to the next slide. So then just using Vassal, we could click up the units into approximately where they were going to be. And we left a transparent overlay for the planned positions. And then we started to say, well, what's it going to look like unit by unit, more or less? And we saw a picture that we liked. There's this victory location that we have to fight for, the Blue Star, that whole village.
Austerlitz.
But it's good. That's a fairly defensible place. And then there were these nice woods out ahead of our position that we could use for delay, so that we could do some delaying action.
We've got a question here. So when you're processing these strategies, were you applying this with game mechanics in mind, or just the battle from a historical outlook?
Game mechanics. This is a game mechanical analysis of, if you're going to play the Austerlitz game as the Allies, what could you do to win the game using the game mechanics?
Right. And depending on which rule set you're using, some things are going to be easier to execute than others. I think if we were using a rule set that had more of a stringent command control, this would be a lot harder to pull off, just because of the nature of the whole command setup for the Allied army. And it would have been a lot harder to get stuff marching and getting into these positions if we had that set. We're playing with Premier for the game. So if you guys want to tune in on Monday nights, most Monday nights, we have starting, I guess it's at 7 o'clock here in the Pacific. So that's going to be 10 o'clock on the East. And of course, it's up on YouTube, so you can watch it the next day if you don't want to tune in and watch it live. But we're using the Premier rules, which basically you move as much as you can. For the Allies, they have 8 minutes to move, and the French have got 10 minutes to move. And so you've got to be quick about getting stuff where you want it to be. Otherwise, stuff doesn't get where it is. So, No worries, Hex. But we love having the questions. That helps us be able to clarify stuff. Because I'm sure if you were thinking it, there's probably a few other people that are going to be watching this that have the same question. So
Yeah. This is a great medium, this StreamYard and YouTube live stream, because it creates a conversation. It's really great that you're asking questions, and we have a chance to talk it over live among all of us. It's great. If you were playing the Austerlitz game with Regs 30 or 5th edition or Marie Louise command mechanics, you would probably, if you wanted to optimize to win, you would still find a very dense position for the Allies, maybe in the center. This was a very long march to the flank, which required a lot of organization and not making mistakes, which you can do in Premier. If you had to worry about the command rules, you would probably pick that central position around the Pratzen Plateau. But the left attack, which was done historically, is probably too diffuse to win the game with, whereas a central condensed position, so your army is all in mutual support, and in particular, the artillery has good crossfires and stuff, would probably be an effective way to play.
yeah, definitely. Given the range for your army commanders and things like that, it's important to do that. Otherwise, stuff gets out of command a little too easily and becomes much more challenging to try to get moving in any particular direction. So let's see. Mike's got a question. How does La Bataille compare to Grognard Sim's Incredible Courage Austerlitz? I'm not going to be able to answer that because I've never played that particular game. Have you, Brennan?
No, I haven't played that game, but it would be fun. One of the really interesting things in all of this is to try to go from any given game to the historical principles, and then see if you can apply the historical principles into a game, and if that gives you a good, strong effect in the game. Notably, combined arms, you would hope would work well in any Napoleonic rule system. The mechanics of how you do it in any given rule set may be different, but you're hoping to see that because it was such a part of the history. Another important standard military and gaming principle is the concentration of force. And if you look at that other rule system, are you able to figure out a way to do concentration of force either for the French or the Allies, because it's going to help you win. And then another really important part of the principles, Napoleonic principles, is mutual support. One of the big problems with the Allies' historical left attack was that each individual column was all fighting on their own. First column attacked Telnitz, second column attacked Sokolnitz, third column attacked the Pheasantry, and it was 3 independent fights without a coherent, battle action. So since you're trying to win the game, you want to try to see if you can apply some of those conceptual principles into your gameplay to see if it'll help you win. La Bataille has 20-minute turns, so 10-minute turns would go quicker.
And I think the scale is similar. I thought they were more or less battalion level for both, and I don't know if they get down to. I know there's some that go to company level, which is crazy. I don't know how you keep track of all that stuff. So let's see. We've got another question here, or comment. In the 80s, we applied METT-T in the Army for ops. Missions, equipment, time, terrain, and troops seem to work very well in planning.
Okay. You basically can use that type of thinking in a game. This is just a game, but because it's a reasonably authentic simulation, a lot of that concept really will work. And Eric, if you go to the next slide.
Yep.
So this is now an even more detailed look, and it actually has some of those 1980s fire combat principles, like a fire sack. If you zoom in here, you can start to see, this is without the overlays of the, you can see the checkerboard for the Russian battalions. they're lined up in a checkerboard. That's probably their preliminary position. They would likely be fighting the battle in line, but they will still be in that checkerboard. And then you can see pretty clearly where the artillery fire patterns and fire channels are able to go, where the good lines of sight are. La Bataille is really interesting. You know, it has an approximated line of sight and range system, but it's good enough. A lot of the standard principles of converging your fire from, you know, a concave sort of crescent firing position and having channels to shoot through and having the units are dispersed, but the fire converges, you know, that's historically Napoleonic approach, and it remains in a lot of sort of the NATO, you know, tank tactics and stuff in modern warfare. It's very applicable in the La Bataille system, believe it or not, because these are, you know, general historical and terrain principles that work pretty well. So the allies are then able to zoom in fairly close at the planning stage, get a pretty good idea of, yes, there's space, there's room for the infantry checkerboard, there are some good artillery positions, we can put the dragoons and the hussars in a place where they can cover the batteries with reaction charges, and generally this looks like a good fighting position. And here, moving along, you can see that here's the reserve and back. You can see the artillery able to converge onto the clear terrain channels, and you can see over on the right the Austrians with an open zone for their more linear army, but it's, you know, pretty decent terrain for them to be fighting in. So by looking at the battlefield and using the planning toolkit and using some of these principles, you know, combined arms and mutual support and concentration of force, you can plan out your game ahead of time and have a good view either into yourself or with a team of players, who's going where, who's maneuvering the first and second columns, who's maneuvering Lannes' Fifth Corps on the French side. You can use this type of thinking to sketch it out ahead of time, and then you can apply it in the game when everything gets crazy, and you'll have a framework that you're playing towards.
Right. And just to let you know, Brennan, all of my colleagues on the French side are very disappointed in me. They're like, where was our map with our arrows, Eric? You know, they're complaining. Brennan's got arrows. The Austrians and the Russians have arrows. They got stuff. Where are our arrows?
Well, next time they will have them.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm really going to step up my game. Instead, I just said, okay, guys, you go over there, you attack there, and you kind of go over there. And so obviously I need to step up my game there a little bit and get out the colored markers.
I mean, in our group, we'd never really used the PowerPoint before, but since we decided to, you know, when we were talking both at Tempe and at Columbus about trying to do this type of tactics guide, it sort of made sense to start pulling together the modern computer tools, PowerPoint and Vassal and all these things.
Well, I think it's a terrific tool, particularly when we've got the French players, we all live within at least an hour drive of each other. So if we all wanted to get together and sit down around a table, we could. But I mean, your side of the team is scattered across the country, and so trying to get something together where people have an idea what the plan is. This is ideal for that type of thing. And this is what's been really fun with the Vassal games. It's the ability for us to have multiplayer games. We're using Vassal as the driver for the game engine. We are using then Discord as a way for us to communicate. And I don't think we could have been able to do this 20 years ago. We would have had to wait till we get to the convention and then sit down around the table and start pointing, you know, where we're going to go count stuff out. So the technology is fantastic, and it's made for some great gaming opportunities that didn't exist before.
Yeah, it's really fun to play together on Discord and Vassal. The depth and attention that the people who put the Marshall Enterprises and Clash of Arms people who put the original games together, and then the crew who put together the Vassal modules, were so appreciative of all the work that they put in, because it's a wonderful experience for all these people all across the country. Discord's a great Discord's a great platform for it. And I mean, the actual arrow bit, it's very simple. It's just PowerPoint. It's just text overlays and little arrows on top of a PowerPoint scan. So it's very easy to use, nothing fancy. But using it conceptually that way is very helpful. Here's a question. I just jumped in, curious how much game rules versus historic tactics play into this plan. The answer is it's really trying to be authentically historical. The game rules you need to know so that you can know, well, my infantry units, the Russian Green battalions, are going to be able to cover 7 hexes in clear, but there's some slopes and some woods, so it's probably more like an average of 5 or 6, so that in an hour they're going to be covering an average of like a little less than 20 hexes. And you make the arrow in your PowerPoint about that long. So the mechanical part is knowing the rules enough to know how they're going to move. But then how you plan tactically, it's actually trying to use one's knowledge of history and looking at the terrain on the battlefield and one's knowledge of military concepts like the métier that folks were talking about and cavalry scouts. I mean, there's a lot of that thinking that goes into just planning a little war game. You can see here, there's an artillery fire stack being planned. These are 3 or 4 converging batteries that have been, their positions have been selected so that they're behind the woods where they're safe. If they were up at the woods, they'd be in danger from French light infantry infiltration. They're protected by an infantry patrol or an infantry zone. They've got cavalry around them for security. And yet their intent is to fire down that fire channel and, converge the fire onto the place where the opponent's coming out, op4 is coming out of the approach. So it really has a lot of historical thinking in it in a game system.
Right. And one other thing that is an important idea here is that when we're playing the game, we don't want to, it's not a recreation of the battle because we know how the battle turned out. It's our take on how we could do it better. I mean, this is why the Mont Saint-Jean game or Waterloo games are so popular, because they're like, well, can I do better than Napoleon? Could I win? Could I beat Wellington? And so whether it's, the Allies at Austerlitz seeing if they could win, or it's, you're playing the French at Waterloo seeing if you can win, can you do better? Obviously, we're using the rules, we're using historical tactics that the rules reinforce. If you don't do it the right way, you're going to suffer. So the rules have things built into them that reward you for using a more historical or appropriate tactical deployment or tactical usage. And sometimes they're very upfront about that, because depending on what year it is in the Napoleonic campaigns, many of the armies are still very much Frederick the Great kind of linear tactics from the 7 Years' War, and they haven't caught up to what innovations the French have come up with. And so the game designers are kind of shoehorning you into using, you get a benefit for deploying in that particular way. The downside is, of course, there's ways that the French can kind of turn that against you. But you are encouraged to do that by the game design rules in many cases.
Just to do a couple more slides to kind of round this out. So let's zoom out. So this one here is a really detailed look at how the planning tools can take you right down to the level of blocking in, sketching in, like, is the artillery going to perform effectively in that part of the battlefield? And is that where I want to hold the fight or not? Like, if you get the artillery up in the woods, it will be limited. So then we just backed out again to take an overview of it. And then I think there's 1 or 2 more slides just for fun. Here's one of the Austerlitz scenarios gives you free setup instead of historical. And if you have a free setup as the Allies, you can try to do the opposite of what they did historically. And you can try to run a steamroller and see if you can catch the French off guard.
Right. Attack on the right as opposed to on the left.
So, it's from why is this hobby so interesting and so much fun? It's because it rewards historical reading and thinking. It rewards visiting the battlefields when you have a chance. You can see all these places, the maps. I've never been to Austerlitz, but I've been to Borodino, Talavera, Waterloo, and so on. And you can see how closely the paper maps, they match the proportions and distances of the villages and woods and hills. So it's really informing your own human knowledge of what these dramatic events were about. And then it gives you a fun hobby that I think has much more historical texture to it, say, than chess or whatever, in the maneuvers and so on.
Cool. Let's see if we have any other. Was there anything else, or answer?
If you go back to the third and fourth slides, couple more back. It's the linear and concentrated formations. One or two more, yeah. So this is that linear Frederikian formation, and people tend to gravitate towards that when they first start playing La Bataille. They tend to gravitate towards the thin linear formations for whatever reason. It gets all the units involved simultaneously. But if you go down one slide, this type of concentrated combined arms approach is a much more evolved and usually much more effective way of maneuvering in this game to try to win than just the spread.
Right. And so one of the things that happens is, as players, we are oftentimes going to do things that our historical counterparts would not think to do. So the Allies at Austerlitz would not think to have stuff concentrated like this. They would have had their little forces in line. They would have been maneuvering very much 18th century style. Right now on Sundays, I'm playing, what is it? I'm playing Prague, 7 Years' War. I think it's 1757. And I'm fighting my natural urge to start having combined arms stuff with the pieces I have on the board. And, it's very hard to say, nope, I've got to be approaching this in the way that these guys would have been doing it, as opposed to what I know works much better. That's an innovation that's coming in 40 or 50 years. And so that's always the challenge sometimes as we're playing these games, is not to, not to let sometimes our ideas of what we know is going to be happening affect necessarily the play that we're doing, that affects a particular time period. And you particularly see that the difference between the 7 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars, the application of the different French systems, with not only the organization of the army, but then also the application of the tactics and the combined arms are major innovations that are forced upon the French. Well, some of them are pre-French Revolution, but a lot of them are adaptations to what they have to deal with during the different wars there, before Napoleon comes to power. So any other questions we have? All right. Hex to Hex says he did this a lot playing Great Battles of the American Civil War. I presume linear, where you have all your forces lined up. Yeah, it is a common type of thing for folks to do when they're playing the game. So
I think in the Civil War, they'd move by and large to rifles and percussion and stuff. The rates of fire were higher. The ranges were somewhat longer, and the formations tended to be much more linear, back to linear that they had been in the 18th century. But at the same time, they had developed the marching techniques to keep a fighting line together, even moving through the rough terrain of the Civil War and so on. So they had that habit, and they were able to do both the dynamic maneuvering of the groups while also fighting in firing lines. I don't know Civil War system, but the game system. But
I've heard good things about both the great battles of American Civil War and the great campaigns of the American Civil War. They've both gotten a lot of good praise. I have a fair number of friends who play both systems and enjoy it.
Here's a question for you, Eric. What happened when you applied Napoleonic tactics to the Frederikian time? Did it work?
I am trying to see if I can pull that off over on the I guess it would be the Prussian left wing. It seems to be very common with all the battles that I've seen so far from this time period. They're not much different than what you might see if you were playing the Romans or the Greeks. You've got this line of infantry in the center. You've got cavalry out on the wings, and the artillery is, not doing anything that's all that terribly important. It's not concentrated. It's maybe plinking away here or there. But then you have these big cavalry battles out on the flanks, and then whoever wins then can go turn, the infantry line. And how original is that? It's not original at all. It's been what's been going on for thousands of years. So I am trying to see if I can get a group of grenadiers to come down to support my cavalry, which is not at all a Frederikian type of a thing. But I just can't help myself. I was planning on sending a bunch of artillery down there. Because if there's no artillery or infantry fire to keep the cavalry honest, they'll have these giant stacks that are just like these moving, it's like the Death Star. It just shows up and it blows up your units, kind of a thing. So I thought I need to get some sort of firepower down there to force him to reduce his stack size, and then maybe I would have more parity. And I keep pounding the table like, where are my horse guns? Where are my horse guns? I need my horse guns here with my cavalry. And of course, they're nowhere to be found. So, all right.
Because they didn't exist in the armies at the point. I think what we would generally encourage people to do when they play La Bataille games is try out the more Napoleonic type of combined arm tactics, work with it and see how it works for you. Probably you'll find it's way more dynamic and impactful, I would say.
Yes, and in those games, of course, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. Where things might be different, of course, as we said with Brennan's approach to Austerlitz, is taking his ideas and those of his colleagues and saying, where's a good place that we can defend? How do we want to try to win the battle? We don't want to necessarily, replicate history and get in trouble like happened historically. What can we do to see if we can do something better? And so that's something that with any of these battles, you're not only allowed to do, you're encouraged to do. And then just experiment and see how it goes. And if it doesn't go well, it's all right. Clear off the table and start again. All right. Any last comments or questions before we wrap things up? Going once, going twice. All right. Well, Brennan, I want to once again thank you so much for preparing these slides and working on the different stuff here with the tactical guides for people to use. These are free tools that you guys can download and use. Brennan and I are both, passionate advocates for the La Bataille system and Napoleonic gaming and wargaming as a whole. And so we're really happy that we're able to share this with you folks so that you're able to enjoy the game more, play the games more, and learn more about, this time period and what the tactics were like.
Because use of historic tactics in the game usually does work very well.
Yeah.
Which says a lot about authenticity.
Yeah, so I think we had one last question. So does La Bataille reward the use of historic tactics better than most at this scale? Yes, absolutely. Yes. I think the battalion level is the right scale for this type of battle. I think as you get larger, up to the regiment and up to obviously brigades, and then at the higher level division. I mean, you're into a totally different realm. I think with the battalion level, it captures the right intensity, and you really get to see the rock paper scissors type of approach, and the ability then to use, your infantry in different formations, your cavalry in different formations. I think that's battalion level is the right level for this type of tactics and a tactical game like this. So, all right. Well, Brennan, once again, thank you very much. I will see your happy, smiling face on Monday, and I'm looking forward to another installment. If you folks have a chance to watch any of the live streams, as I said, usually on Monday nights currently we're playing Austerlitz. We're using the premier rules. On Sunday nights right now, I'm playing Prague. This is the Battle of the Age of Reason series of games. It's from Clash of Arms. They're beautiful games, both of them. And then if you want to look at anything I've done in the past, about 2 years ago during the pandemic, we did a 6-player game of Moskva from Clash of Arms. And that was on Vassal, and the same kind of setup with Discord for people chatting. We did a Dresden game, also from Clash of Arms. We did Aspirant Esling, and that's from Marshall Enterprises. And then recently, we had done a Linny, second edition Linny from Clash of Arms. So you can check out those playlists. If you're ever suffering from insomnia some night, just put one on, put your headphones on. I'm sure you will be snoring in no time at all. But I have gotten a lot of feedback where people, it's helped them learn and understand how the game works, kind of seeing the mechanics of how it's happening and how we're approaching it. And so if you have any comments or questions about this, go ahead and put it in there and let Brennan and I know what you might want to see in our next episode. So until then, everybody, take care. Brennan, thank you so much. And
Bye-bye.
I hope that you are well, and we'll catch you on Monday night.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye, everybody.